In 1995, a sound returned to Yellowstone that had not echoed through these valleys in almost 70 years, and by the time this video ends, you will understand how that single howl was powerful enough to change the course of rivers, resurrect entire forests, and rewrite the fate of an ecosystem that scientists believed was already broken beyond repair. This is not simply the story of a predator hunting its prey. This is the story of what happens when humanity removes a single species from the wild, watches the world unravel for 7 decades, and then, in a desperate gamble, tries to put the pieces back together. What unfolds next will surprise you, because nobody, not even the biologists who orchestrated it, expected the reintroduction of a single predator to reach so far beyond the animals themselves and touch the rivers, the trees, the birds, and even the shape of the land. For thousands of years, the wolves of Yellowstone ruled an empire of pine forest and open grassland that stretched across what is now Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. They moved in tight, disciplined family units, communicating through howls that could travel for miles, and hunting elk that numbered in the tens of thousands across the plateau. This was a relationship built on tension, brutality, and balance. The wolves killed the sick, the old, and the unwary, while the healthy and the strong survived to reproduce. And the elk in turn never lingered too long in any one place, because to stay still near a river or a stand of young trees was to risk death. That constant pressure, that fear written into the elk's daily behavior, quietly shaped the entire landscape without either species ever realizing it. Then, in the early 20th century, the government of the United States decided that wolves were an obstacle to livestock and to the growing human presence in the region, and a campaign of extermination began that was as thorough as it was merciless. Trappers, hunters, and poison were deployed across the park with the singular goal of erasing the species from the ecosystem, and by 1926, the last wolf pack inside Yellowstone had been wiped out. For the first time in more than 10,000 years, the valleys fell silent. No howls echoed off the canyon walls at dusk. No large predator patrolled the open meadows. It seemed, on the surface, like a victory for ranchers and a triumph of human control over nature. Within a few short decades, that illusion would collapse entirely. With no wolves left to hunt them, the elk population exploded. Herds that once moved constantly across the landscape, always wary of an ambush, began to linger for months at a time along riverbanks and in valley bottoms, grazing without restraint on the young willow, aspen, and cottonwood saplings that were trying to grow there. What might have seemed like a minor shift in animal behavior triggered a catastrophe that would take scientists decades to fully understand. The elk ate the new tree growth down to nothing, year after year, and without young trees to replace the old ones, the forests along the rivers began to thin out and die. Beavers, which depend on willow and aspen to build their dams and to feed themselves through the winter, vanished almost entirely from many parts of the park. Without beaver dams, the rivers lost their natural pools and side channels, and the water began cutting straight, fast-moving paths through the soil, causing the riverbanks to erode at an alarming rate. Songbirds that nested in the dense streamside willow thickets disappeared along with the habitat itself. An entire web of life had been quietly built around the presence of a single predator. And now, with that predator gone, the web was unraveling thread by thread, and almost no one outside the scientific community noticed it happening. By the early 1990s, after nearly 7 decades without wolves, Yellowstone's ecosystem was in a state that alarmed biologists studying the park. Elk numbers had grown so large in certain areas that the vegetation could no longer keep pace with the grazing pressure, and the classic postcard image of Yellowstone as an untouched wilderness was, in reality, a landscape quietly starving for the very predator it had lost. It was against this backdrop that a controversial and historic decision was made. Wildlife officials, working with conservation biologists, proposed capturing wild wolves from Canada, where healthy populations still roamed the forests of Alberta, and releasing them directly into Yellowstone National Park in an attempt to restore what had been destroyed. The plan ignited fierce opposition from ranchers who feared for their livestock and from hunters who worried about competition for elk, and the debate raged for years before permission was finally granted. In January of 1995, The first wolves captured in Canada were transported across the border in wooden crates and released into acclimation pens inside Yellowstone, where they were kept for several weeks to help them adjust to their new territory before being set free into the wild. Over the following 2 years, a total of 31 wolves were released across the park, forming the founding packs of a population that no one, not even the scientists behind the project, could predict the ultimate impact of. What happened next became one of the most closely studied natural experiments in the history of wildlife biology, and the results reshaped how scientists across the world understand the role of top predators in any ecosystem. The wolves began hunting almost immediately, and their return to the landscape was as violent and efficient as it had been for thousands of years before their extermination. A wolf pack does not simply chase down an elk and overpower it through brute force alone. It hunts through coordination, patience, and an almost surgical understanding of the terrain. Packs test herds by running alongside them, watching for any animal that shows the slightest hesitation, a limp, an old injury, a moment of exhaustion, because that hesitation is a death sentence. Once a target is identified, the wolves work in relay, taking turns pressing the chase so that the elk never gets a moment to recover its breath, driving it toward terrain like deep snow, steep slopes, or river crossings where its size and speed become disadvantages rather than strengths. The kill itself is fast and brutal, but it represents only a fraction of what the wolves actually changed in Yellowstone. The far more powerful transformation came not from how many elk the wolves killed, but from how the elk began to behave simply because the wolves existed at all. This phenomenon, which scientists came to call the ecology of fear, may be the single most important discovery to come out of the entire wolf reintroduction project. Elk that had spent generations grazing complacently in river valleys with no predator to fear suddenly found themselves hunted again, and their behavior transformed almost overnight. Herds stopped lingering for months in the open river bottoms where wolves could easily corner them. They began moving more frequently, avoiding the narrow brush-choked corridors along streams where an ambush was more likely, and spending less time grazing in any single spot before moving on. The elk were not disappearing from these areas because the wolves were killing them all. They were leaving because staying still had once again become dangerous, and that single behavioral shift set off a chain reaction across the entire ecosystem that nobody had fully anticipated. With elk no longer camped out along the rivers for months at a time, the young willow, aspen, and cottonwood saplings that had been grazed into oblivion for 70 years finally got the chance to grow. Within just a few years of the wolves' return, researchers documented willow stands along certain streams growing taller than they had in decades, in some cases reaching heights of over 10 feet, where before they had been chewed down to stubs year after year. As these trees returned, so did the animals that depended on them. Beavers, absent from many parts of the park for generations, began recolonizing streams where willow had regrown thick enough to sustain them, and beaver dams began reappearing across the landscape for the first time since before the wolves had been exterminated. Those dams did something remarkable to the physical geography of the park. They slowed the flow of water, created deep pools, and forced streams to spread out into multiple channels instead of cutting one fast, eroding path through the soil. Riverbanks that had been collapsing for decades began to stabilize, and wetlands formed behind the dams, creating entirely new habitat for fish, amphibians, and waterfowl that had been absent from these stretches of river for a generation. The return of dense streamside willow and aspen also brought back songbird populations that depend on that specific habitat to nest and raise their young, species that had been quietly vanishing from large sections of the park without most visitors ever noticing their absence. Scientists studying the park also observed a ripple effect through the park's mid-sized predators. Coyotes, which had thrived in the absence of wolves and had become the dominant predator across much of Yellowstone, suddenly found themselves being killed and displaced by the returning wolf packs, since wolves view coyotes as direct competitors and will kill them without hesitation when given the chance. As coyote numbers fell in areas reclaimed by wolves, populations of the small mammals that coyotes had been suppressing, like rodents, began to rebound, which in turn benefited foxes and birds of prey that hunt those same small mammals. Even scavengers benefited from the wolves' return. Ravens, magpies, bald eagles, and grizzly bears all learned to follow wolf packs and feed on the carcasses left behind after a kill, gaining access to a reliable source of food, especially in the harsh winter months when other food sources become scarce. A single predator, restored to a landscape it had once ruled, had triggered a cascade of consequences that touched nearly every species in the park, down to the insects and the soil itself. This phenomenon is what ecologists call a trophic cascade, and Yellowstone became the most famous, most thoroughly documented example of it anywhere on Earth. A trophic cascade occurs when a change at the very top of a food chain, in this case the return of an apex predator, triggers a chain reaction of effects that ripple all the way down through every level of the ecosystem, ultimately reshaping the physical landscape itself. Before the wolves returned, few scientists believed that a single predator species could have such a profound influence on something as massive and complex as an entire river system. The transformation of Yellowstone's rivers, sometimes described by researchers as the wolves indirectly changing the very geography of the park, became one of the most compelling pieces of evidence ever gathered for just how deeply interconnected every part of a wild ecosystem truly is. Remove one piece, even one that seems distant from rivers and trees and birds, and the entire structure can slowly crumble. Restore that piece, and the system can begin to heal itself in ways that no human engineering project could replicate. None of this transformation came without conflict, and the story of Yellowstone's wolves has never been a simple tale of nature restored to harmony. Ranchers in the region surrounding the park continued to report livestock losses to wolves that wandered beyond the protected boundaries of Yellowstone, and hunting groups voiced ongoing frustration over reduced elk numbers in certain hunting zones outside the park, where elk had grown accustomed to grazing without pressure for decades. These tensions have never fully disappeared, and wolf management outside the park's borders remains a fiercely debated issue between conservationists, wildlife agencies, and local communities who must live alongside a predator that their grandparents spent a lifetime trying to eliminate. The wolves themselves have also faced internal struggles for dominance, since pack structure in Yellowstone is built on rigid hierarchy, and battles between rival packs for territory can be just as brutal and lethal as any hunt for elk, with entire packs sometimes wiped out by rivals competing for the same stretch of valley. More than 2.5 decades after that first release of 31 wolves from Canada, Yellowstone now supports multiple packs spread across the park's vast wilderness, and the ancient war between wolves and elk that once defined this landscape for thousands of years has resumed in full. Elk herds move differently than they did in the 70 years without predators. Rivers run differently, forests grow differently, and an entire generation of wildlife biologists has built their careers studying exactly how and why. What began as a desperate, controversial experiment to correct a mistake made nearly a century earlier became one of the most powerful demonstrations in modern science of a simple truth that nature had always known and humanity had forgotten: that predators are not the enemy of a healthy wilderness. They are often the very foundation that holds it together. Yellowstone did not simply get its wolves back in 1995. It got its rivers back, its forests back, and its balance back, all because of a single species that 4 legs and a howl were enough to bring an entire ecosystem back from the edge of collapse.